welcome to the fourth episode of my podcast, The Never-Ending Experiment. I'm Kim Anderson. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about my rare disease. It's called ALS4, and I've only had this diagnosis for about 5 or 6 years. It's something that I've had my entire life, and I wanted to devote a whole podcast to it because it has been such a complicated learning experience to have this disease, and it's changed a lot over the years. And I just want to go over some of the research and some of the things that they have learned about in the last decade or so. First of all, I was pretty normal when I was very young, when I was a toddler. All of my early milestones were normal. It wasn't until I was around 3 or 4 years old and I had to run more and walk more, and I started to notice that I was walking with an unusual gait. So my feet were turned in a little bit, and that's when I started to see doctors to try to figure out what was going on. So it's been that long, back in the early 80s, that we started investigating, and it wasn't until around 5 years ago that I finally got a diagnosis. Having a diagnosis has not been as easy as it should be, and that's because of what it's called, ALS4. And nowadays, a lot of people know about ALS because of the big campaign they had for fundraising around 8, 9, 10 years ago, the Ice Bucket Challenge, and that really put ALS in the spotlight. Previous to that, it was often known as Lou Gehrig's disease. I have had a lot of issues since I got that diagnosis because people just hear ALS. They don't understand what the number 4 means after that. And in fact, there are a lot of different types of ALS, and I'm not even the normal type of ALS4. Even myself, I have a different mutation than the other people with ALS4. So once you get into the naming of diseases, you can really see how it's a decision. The name of the disease doesn't always tell you that much about the disease. And I think for a normal person who has very little scientific understanding, it can be very confusing. So even as I go to the professional health care workers, they still want to categorize me differently now that I've had the ALS diagnosis. Now, before that, I was using the diagnosis SMA, which stands for spinal muscular atrophy. And that is a very similar disease, and it also has many types. So it's a bit of a messy world. And for rare diseases, rare diseases as a group are actually not that rare. It's just that each individual disease is rare. And I think that's just something that most people don't really understand, is how individual our physical health is and how individual a disease can be. They're not always simple, easy to categorize diseases, and that's why we often have different types. And so you have to look at the individual as a whole to understand what's going on. So for me, the diagnosis of ALS4, although it's caused problems with some people because they assume that to mean ALS, and it is very different than the normal ALS, which is usually pretty sudden onset and usually a very severe decline over a pretty short period of time. For me, I've had this, like I said, since I was a young child, since pretty much I started walking long distances. And that's when they started noticing it. And since then, it has been a very slow degeneration. So it has changed over the years. It has gotten slowly worse. And it's in the extremities. So it's in my legs and forearms. And it's now become very obvious in my hands. But that didn't really start until I was around a teenager. So what's happening now with a lot of these diseases is there is a lot of progress. I mean, the big campaign that they had for ALS, as much as I disagree with turning every complicated issue into a simple gimmick that people can use to make themselves feel better about giving money, which is ironic because actually the ice bucket challenge was supposed to be that you put ice on your head if you did not give money as a way to guilt people into giving money. So it's either give money or dump this ice over your head. And people just did both because they didn't understand. They didn't even understand that simple task, which was kind of a joke. And so it just shows you how people often line up to do silly things if it makes yourself feel like you're doing a good thing when really you could just give money. And why not have a robust public healthcare system? And that would be the best option, I think, in order to deal with these diseases is to have a lot of it publicly funded, because as soon as you put the profit motivation into research, it can go down a different road. And guess what? Rare diseases don't have a big profit motivation at all, because you're often making a drug that you could only sell to one person. And you don't get to go through the production line of creating this new popular drug for millions of people, like, say, with the vaccine. Instead, it has to be individualized. And I'm very much a believer in individualized medicine. I really think that that is showing the best results. And the other thing that has changed, and that I think is also a reason why they are now looking at treatments that are actually showing positive results. So this is for SMA, that they have tried some treatments that show promise. They've also tried some treatments with ALS that have showed promise. So showing a benefit doesn't always mean that they're curing the disease. Sometimes it just means that they're stopping it from getting worse and maybe even getting slightly better. I don't know of any yet that has shown a complete recovery from any of these diseases. I'm not keeping a close tab on it, but I am keeping track of what they're doing with ALS4. If you want to know a little bit more about ALS4, there is a website called ALS4.org, and they have done a lot of research. So what happened with me is that I was, going to these neurological clinics, so seeing a neurologist almost every year. Growing up, I went to a lot of different doctors. I grew up in both Saskatchewan and Alberta. I was 6 years old when they took me to the University of Saskatchewan Hospital in Saskatoon, and I was there for 2 weeks doing all kinds of tests. And that was such an eye-opening experience, especially for a child. And it showed me things about humanity, I guess, that were not even necessarily about my disease, but seeing other patients, seeing children that came from very different backgrounds that were really scared of the hospital, and, the mean nurses and the nice nurses. I could see right away some of the nurses were very kind and others were very strict and even mean-spirited. And I also learned to advocate for myself. When I was there, they would lock the sides of the hospital bed so that I couldn't get out in the night. And they told me that was so that I wouldn't fall out. And I said, I've never fallen out of bed. I don't know why this would suddenly be an issue. And what it did is it kept me from getting out of bed to go to the bathroom. And I really didn't like that. And I didn't like having to call the nurse in to come put the cage bars down, essentially, is what it was. And I had to negotiate with the nurse, and eventually she did agree to put one of those down so that I could get in and out of bed. But that was something I remember, just how dangerous that was, because if you try and get out of bed with those bars on, I remember thinking, I'm going to get more injured trying to get out of here, and maybe that's a bit of claustrophobia that I had, but it taught me, and I think that the way I was raised too was never to be, as always as a critical thinker. So I never assumed that the adults had it all figured out, and that's just something that I am grateful for. So after that, they still didn't have a diagnosis, and I think back then there was a sense of optimism, like, we're gonna fix you up, we're gonna go to the hospital and fix you up, and I think that's how a lot of people see it, and that's how a lot of people react, just with this automatic positivity about those kind of things. But actually, a lot of the tests were very uncomfortable. I don't know if any of you have seen Stranger Things. That certainly brought a lot of memories back for me, because, the little girl in that show has her head shaved because they're always doing brain scans on her. But for me, of course, they didn't shave my head. So what they did is they glued all these little electrodes to your head in order to do a brain scan. And it was this nasty, terrible smelling glue. And afterwards, my hair was a mess and we had to wash all this nasty stuff out. So at first I thought, oh, that's not historically accurate. And then I thought, well, maybe it is historically accurate. If they were going to be doing these tests on her, they wouldn't want all that hair in the way. And that was something that I don't think they do that anymore. I haven't had a brain scan in a long time because it was one of the many tests that I did that was completely normal. And most of the tests did come back normal. And so it was a matter of just searching and searching. After that, the newest test I did after that was called a nerve conduction test. And I did that when I was 11. And I think that really marked a point of departure for me where I stopped trusting the doctors almost completely. And actually, I should go back a little bit more in time. So when I was 8 years old, I actually had surgery on my foot. Now this is a weakening disease, so there's no fixing a weakening disease with surgery. That doesn't work unless there's something sort of blocking a nerve or something like that. So it was a very difficult to understand why they were doing it. They had a lot of ideas of what might work, but I think they just really didn't know. And a lot of the motivation in the Western medicine model is sort of to use surgery a lot, and it didn't help. It did make my foot, it was weaker after that, and I had a cast on it for quite a while. So not only did they cut into the foot, they took a piece of nerve for a nerve biopsy. And so I lost feeling on that side of my foot for years. And even now, it is a bit tingly. There is a bit of, it's still loss of sensation, some almost 35 years later. So after that operation and going through that and having to wear braces after that, so after that procedure, and after they took the cast off, and I'm still not totally sure why they had that cast on, maybe just to protect the loss of nerve, but it was all very, very experimental. I'll just say that it was experimental because I couldn't even tell you why they were doing it. Even as an adult, when I went over the medical notes, it didn't make any sense. They mentioned something about part of my foot being deformed, and that's simply not true. There's no deformity on my foot of any kind. It's just the normal effect of, loss of muscle. So it didn't make any sense why they did it. It certainly didn't help. It did make things worse. And then at 11, I did this nerve conduction test that I mentioned, and that involves electric shocks, repeated electric shocks, pretty much the same thing that they do to torture people into confessing, I guess. I'm sure they would argue it's not nearly as extreme. I wouldn't want to know what that's like for someone to go through that, because I can say even at the lower end of electric shocks, it is very painful. It is very uncomfortable. And then they do a muscle test where they put a needle right into your muscle, and then they want you to flex the muscle. And it was also gruesome and horrific. And you're looking down at your leg, seeing this big needle. It was a big needle, not a regular size needle, like a big one attached to an electric cord. And I still remember the doctor, though. He was quite a character, and he looked like he had been through some electricity himself. His hair was all frizzy and gray and standing up all over. But he was so excited about this test, and he was like, oh, look, your muscle's talking. But you know what? The positivity and all that didn't help me. It didn't make it less painful. It made me less trusting. And after that, I really pulled away as much as I could. I continued to go to the doctors every once in a while. Sometimes you don't really need to do anything medically, especially if there's no available treatment. But at the same time, working on your health overall, I think, is really, really important. And the good thing that my parents did give me was broad-mindedness and openness to a lot of different things. And my stepmother took me to a whole bunch of holistic doctors and naturopaths, and started going to the health food store when I was around 10. And I became vegetarian around that time as well. So as a teenager, I continued wearing braces. I continued to see some deterioration in my arms. But by the time I was in my 20s, I still had a lot of energy. I was still able to walk, pretty long distances with my braces. I was able to carry a backpack, and so I traveled around Europe by myself, and I moved to Montreal by myself, and I was there for 3 years, and I finished my degree. So I did do quite a lot of physical activity, and I kind of pushed it, and I didn't see doctors for a while back then. I kind of pushed it away and I was like, I'm just gonna, I felt fine. But by the end of my 20s, I realized that there was some more deterioration. And I think that was a bit of a shock. I think that in my head, I kind of thought, again, trying to be optimistic, like maybe it won't get worse once I'm an adult. Like I kind of thought maybe this disease has something to do with me just growing up, and maybe I wasn't growing properly, and then once I'm an adult, it'll be more stable. That wasn't the case. And it was very hard for doctors to really give me any real answers, because there are so many diseases with similar symptoms. It really is a complicated thing to try to figure out a diagnosis for a rare disease. So I don't blame them for taking the shrug, like we don't know, we'll figure it out kind of thing. Like as the research continues. When I went back to the doctors in my late 20s, early 30s, one of them said, we don't have anything right now. We don't have any treatments. We don't really have anything but these genetic tests that they were doing, which the government would only fund one by one, and as a blood test, right? And nowadays you can do DNA tests pretty easily with a saliva test. You don't need to get a blood test. And, the doctor said in about 3 or 4 years, the way that the economics of the situation is changing, you'll probably be able to get affordable testing within the next few years to show you, that we'll find out what the gene is, and we'll figure out what is going on. And sure enough, around 3 or 4 years later, and it was very complicated because I was living in British Columbia at the time, and they said no to doing the funding for the test. And then I came back to Alberta and I thought about looking for funding again. And I was just so impatient and I really wanted to know, to find out what it was. It's an American company. If you want me to go into a little bit of the economics, there's a lot of American and Canadian healthcare involved in this whole story, in this whole thing. So this company that does the genetics test, they do a panel. So for someone with a weakening disease like me, they would do a panel of over 80 different genes to test all of them, that are all of the ones that are known within their database to have some connection to a neurological disease. So that's a lot of different genes involved in, muscle strength. So that test, I eventually got that done. And sure enough, I got a result. And it showed a mutation in the senataxin gene. And senataxin is associated with a couple other issues. And one of them was this disease called ALS4. So all I did was look it up on Google, and I found this website, ALS4.org, and I reached out to the contact on the website, and there was a woman who put me in touch with the doctors who are working on this disease, and they're at the National Institute of Health in Maryland in the United States. So it's a public health company in the United States that does really incredible research. No matter what you're looking up in science, like there are a lot of studies that are done out of the National Institute of Health. But for me, my original thought was Secret of NIM. I grew up with this animation, The Secret of NIM, which stands for National Institute of Mental Health, where they're giving all these special drugs to rats, and of course they get really smart, and that was just a really influential film from my childhood. But the National Institute of Health is, right next door to that in Maryland. So I had the diagnosis, and then I did a little bit more reading about this ALS4. And so it turns out that back in the early 2000s, a group of people with this disease that had inherited it. So this was well known in their family to exist, and many people in their family had this similar disease to what I have. And they traced their genealogy all the way back to the 1600s, where it was known that there was an ancestor of theirs with the disease. And I think because this is often a late onset disease, it's not always as severe in childhood. I think I was probably on the lower age range for when it started. And I think because of that, a lot of people had a lot of children. And so it spread and turned into a whole lineage of people with this same disease and is ongoing. Now, the fact that this family happened to be in Maryland, and this is right next to the National Institute of Health, is, just a coincidence, but probably a happy coincidence for them. And so they were able to get in touch with these researchers who put it together and actually found the gene in the early 2000s. And, since then, they grew this organization around it, and they reached out to their family members and got it organized. So I reached out and I got an appointment there at the National Institute of Health. And that was now a few years ago, I think around 4 years ago. And I've kept in contact with them. Of course, during the pandemic, a lot of things shut down, so there wasn't a whole lot going on. But they have done a lot of research, and I was able to be a subject in one of the studies that they did. There's a picture of my hand and a picture of the inside of my leg, which is very weird because they do MRIs, and a little piece of my DNA code that they show and they compare to other animals, which is very interesting. So basically, they're saying that the mutation that I have and that the other family has is so rare that this particular gene tends to be very stable. So this is a very active protein that is made from the gene, the Senataxin protein. It's also one of the largest proteins that we make. So it's not just one little gene that comes on every once in a while that only affects your neurology. It's part of the epigenetic process. So if you're not very familiar with genetics, what epigenetics is the actions that happen within and to DNA that helps it to replicate and to transcribe these different proteins. So when we look at genetics, we're looking at just the basic code of what your DNA is, what those little nucleotides are. But when you look at epigenetics, you're looking at how it functions and how it changes and all of the little molecules that are involved in those processes. And it's a whole other language. I did take an introductory course to epigenetics, and it is like you have to start learning the names of all these molecules and how they work because, things like HK387 and exist. I like that one. Exist. It's just XIST, and it has to do with the X chromosome. So it's another language. They've developed this entirely new language just to describe all of these molecules and how they work together. You may have heard of methylation. That's something that is part of epigenetics, and that's how a lot of the genes get turned on and off. And so to have a genetic mutation on a protein that is itself involved in epigenetics is a weird kind of meta thing where it's like the gene, because that's the thing with genes is you have to understand that it is living. It is part of our living organism to have these genes, and they do things on their own. Like there's no outside force coming in and pushing it this way and that. It's coming from within the DNA. And a lot of people use the metaphor of a blueprint for DNA. But what they don't understand is that imagine the blueprint, but the people that work on the blueprint to turn that into a reality are also coming out of the blueprint itself. So there's no outside person coming in to do it. It's all coming from within the cells. It's coming from the DNA itself. Now, the actual mechanisms involved in what it's doing is like really, really advanced. Even though I took that introductory course in epigenetics, it still didn't. It made me understand what the kind of language I was looking at. I couldn't explain to you what exactly is going on. I just know in general sort of what it involves, which is the way that the DNA transcribes. And so this particular genetic mutation actually increases the function of what it's doing in the cell. So even though I have a weakness, which is like a deficiency in my nerves, there's actually a hyperactivity of what's going on at a cellular level. And to make it more complicated, there may actually be positive attributes to having this mutation. It's not all negative. And a lot of times you see that is that these mutations come out of a reaction to another factor that it may be trying to correct, or it's reacting to something. And so it may actually give you some benefit in some parts of your body, in some parts of your life, but not all. And so there's always that setback. I just focus on being active. Don't sit there for too long. Make sure you get up. And that was their biggest recommendation too. When I went to the NIH, is just try to stay on your feet. Try to keep walking. If you need aids to walking, keep doing it, because so long as your body is still doing those things, then it's easier to bring back strength when you start doing it, as opposed to if you just give up. When I was 6 years old, I got up early in the morning, I think like at 6 a.m., and I played piano, and I did these physio exercises, and sometimes they even took me out of school to do more physio. And then I was enrolled in dance. I did tap dance for 3 years. So I did so much at that age. They really worked me out. If working out worked, it would have worked, because I did it all. So I just find that really ignorant when people think, oh, you should just work out. It's like, yeah, I thought of that. We all thought of that. Like it's a disease, It doesn't work the same way as a normal person. Otherwise, I would just be normal and there wouldn't be anything to investigate. And I did so much with my hands, I have a fine arts degree. Again, if working out my hands would have worked to keep my muscle strength, I would have it now. But it was the opposite. It was like the more that I pushed myself too far, I found that to be as big of a detriment to doing nothing at all. So it's a matter of balance, and I think remaining physically active is something important. And yeah, it's been really incredible how much I've learned. If you're listening and you have a rare disease yourself, you just kind of have to be motivated to really try and do some research on your own. And doctors are great and they can help you a lot, but they see hundreds of patients, maybe even thousands, and so for them to fully understand everything about each and every case is kind of impossible. The best they can do is to get you to the right tests and to get you to the right specialists that may know more. And I've talked to tons of neurologists and neurogeneticists now, and now they have physiatrists. There's even new specialists that I never heard of before. I'm grossed out by a lot of the medical stuff. If you look at my art, you'll see I deal with the body a lot. And some people would think that some of it is like a bit horrific and gruesome. There's a lot of blood and veins and things like that. And I do think that it comes from the disease. It sort of affected my psychology a lot, and I've thought a lot about mortality. Obviously, losing my mom at such a young age, and I also lost my little brother. Now, he had a genetic disease as well called Chart syndrome, and that's also from a mutation or from a genetic issue. So I feel very certain that there is a profound connection between my mom's illness and mine and my little brother's. So for me not to have kids when I'm the first one in the lineage that has this mutation makes me so relieved. I'm so glad that I don't have descendants that will have to suffer through this. I hope that I'll be able to find a treatment and be able to get some of my life back and be able to do more and be able to recover. I think that would be fantastic. I do have that optimism because it's coming from multiple different sources. So I do feel that I am in a good position. So, yeah, if you're interested in any of this genetic stuff, I hope you maybe take a look on some of those links on ALS4. So, I'm glad I was able to do this whole podcast and explain everything because I find I'm very wary to tell people what I have just because they will react to the ALS4. And so it's easier to be able to just tell the whole story so that people understand the context of what the disease is. And they did give me a prognosis, which is a fairly normal lifespan, but with lesser mobility with time. And they said that most people are still able to speak and use their face, because you may know of Stephen Hawking, who lost way more than I would likely be to lose, even if I just continued like this. So, what better career to have than to just speak all the time? So, that's what I'm going for. Thank you for listening.